Hello bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with a spoiler-free review of Wicked Saints by Emily A Duncan. I did receive an e-ARC or an advanced reader copy from the publisher in exchange for an honest review, so thank you to the publishers for providing me with an early copy. This is a YA high fantasy, and it's the first book in a new trilogy called Something Dark and Holy. The title of the trilogy is very fitting because this was definitely a dark book, and before I go further, I want to give a content warning. There are two types of magic in this world. One is magic provided by the gods, and the other is blood magic, and because of that, there's a lot of blood and a lot of self-harm to perform that type of magic present in this book. There are lots of scenes that are very bloody. People are described as being covered in blood. Characters are constantly cutting themselves on their hands and on their arms to be able to perform blood magic, and if that is something that you're going to be uncomfortable with, then I recommend not reading this book. I'm not someone who's very easily upset by reading things like that, and I was a little uncomfortable reading that in some of these scenes. So while this book is definitely YA, it's definitely geared more towards the older end of the YA spectrum. I wouldn't quite call it new adult. It felt very YA to me, but it is pretty dark and pretty bloody. In case you don't want to know very much about the book at all, I'm going to start with just my overall thoughts and my rating before I move into some more specifics. The whole review will be spoiler-free, but I'll start with really vague thoughts and move into more detailed thoughts after that. I ended up giving this book 4 out of 5 stars, and overall, I really enjoyed it. I did struggle a little bit in the beginning, but the further I got into the story, I was more and more invested in these characters and the stakes of the story, and by the end, I was left wanting more and wanting to know what's going to happen next. Alright, so let me tell you a little more about the story. I'm going to start with the characters. You see from 2 point of views in this book. One of the main characters is Nadia. She is a cleric of Kalyazin, which is a country that is very religious. They have a pantheon of gods, so there's lots of different gods that represent different things, like a god of war, a god of death, a god of healing, lots of different gods, and Nadia is a cleric, which means that she can talk to the gods and that they give her magic, which is a very rare and unique thing even in her country. The other POV character is Seraphim. He is a prince of Trinavia, and in his country they don't believe in the gods, or they've turned away from the gods, and they use blood magic. And Seraphim himself is a very talented blood mage. There is a third main character who you don't get a POV from, and his name is Malakiash. He's also a blood mage from Trinavia. So these two countries, Kalyazin and Trinavia, have been at war for centuries, and all 3 of these characters want to bring this war to an end, and they think that they can do that by assassinating the king of Trinavia. So that's the main plot of the story, is these 3 characters and some side characters working together to assassinate the king and bring an end to this war. And they have to work together even though their 2 countries have completely opposite religious views and basically hate each other. Out of these 3 characters, Seraphim, the prince, was my favorite. Even though he's a prince, he's had a rough life. His father is neglectful and abusive towards him, and he just really wants to end this war and save his country. After that, Malakiash is my second favorite character. He is definitely a very morally gray character, but I just found him really interesting, and I was constantly wanting to know more about him. And then Nadia was my least favorite out of all of the characters. She is sort of this badass female heroine type of character, but she also is one of those characters who is stubborn and tends to rush headfirst into things without thinking them through. I've said this before in my other videos, that's just not a type of character that I enjoy reading. I just find them really frustrating, and she definitely frustrated me at multiple points in the story. There is a romance in this book. It's fairly romance heavy. The synopsis of the book describes it as a forbidden romance, which it is, but to me it was more of a hate to love or enemies to lovers trope, which isn't my favorite romance trope. I just often have a hard time getting on board with it, and I definitely found that in the beginning of the development of this romance I was unsure, but towards the end of the book I was totally sucked into this romance. I was eating it up, and I was definitely feeling a little emotional at the end. Alright, let's talk about the pacing. I mentioned earlier that I struggled a little bit with the beginning, and that had to do with how the book opened. This book opens with a really crazy action sequence, which I don't want to say always doesn't work for me, but it definitely didn't work for me in this book. There was a lot going on in that opening action sequence. Nadia was having to leave behind people that she really cared about, and I felt like I was supposed to be emotionally affected by this, but I wasn't because I didn't have any attachments to these characters. There was not a single scene of setup before that, of being introduced to those characters, and so I just felt like I was being dropped into the middle of this action scene, and I didn't have any context for who these people are or what was going on, and it made it really hard for me to feel invested from the very beginning. I've heard a lot of people say they really liked the action-packed beginning, so not everyone is gonna feel this way, but I definitely struggled with the beginning because of how it opened. But like I said, the more I read, the more invested I got. By the time I got to the 50% mark, I was really intrigued and really wanted to know what was going to happen. The 50% mark is really where I got invested in the romance as well. And then the last 25% of the book, so 75% on, it was intense. It was intense action-wise, it was intense emotionally. Everything was nonstop. There were multiple surprises for me. There were some heartbreaks for me. The last quarter of this book was really good. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the world. I thought the religion aspect of the world was really interesting, to have these two different religions that were pitted against each other, and it led to some really interesting conversations about religion and how much freedom and choice you have when you're following a religion. I found that stuff to be really fascinating. Because the world is Russian inspired, there were definitely a lot of names that were very hard to pronounce, and I found a lot of times that I wouldn't even try to pronounce it in my head. I would just like memorize what the word looked like and I would just move on. Another thing that I struggled with a little bit was the magic system. I already mentioned about the blood magic and how that made me a little bit uncomfortable. There was just blood everywhere. People were often described as being covered in blood or dripping in blood. People were losing too much blood to be able to walk. So I didn't love that, but it was definitely a very interesting type of magic. But another thing is that it's a very soft magic system. Things aren't very well explained. You know, there's spells that do things, gods that give magic, and things just sort of happen. And there were multiple times where the main characters would do something and I was like, whoa, I didn't know you could do that with your magic. And so sometimes things felt a little bit convenient because the characters would do something that I hadn't realized was a possibility, and that's sort of the nature of a soft magic system anyways, but I guess I wish I had understood more about how the magic worked than what we were given. Because the magic system is so soft, there were some things magic-wise that happened that seemed very abstract, and I had a really hard time wrapping my head around what was happening. There was like a specific chapter that I have in mind that I have no idea what happened. I can't really say anything specific because spoilers, but the writing and the words that were used were very like abstract and nebulous, and I didn't really understand what was happening in that chapter, but maybe some of those things will be explained in the next books. Alright guys, those are my thoughts on Wicked Saints. Overall, I enjoyed it. I thought it was a solid 4-star book. I did struggle a little bit in the beginning, but I was definitely fully invested by the end of the book. I think if you like dark, gothic stories about morally gray characters with a heavy dose of romance, that you might really enjoy this book. If you've read Wicked Saints, or if you plan to read Wicked Saints, let me know down in the comment section. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like bookish content. I post 1 to 2 times a week. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye. Book in a new trilogy called, I don't want to say that either. And she definitely frustrated, and she definitely, and I definitely found her, and she definitely, and I definitely found her, maybe the type, but then, but one thing, but